thank you for joining our Q3 Manufacturing Outlook webinar today. I'm Richard Austin, BDO's National Head of Manufacturing. Ahead of the launch of our BDO and Make UK Q3 Outlook report, which is due out this coming Thursday, the 22nd of September, we are delighted to be joined by Make UK's Chief Executive, Stephen Phipson, CBE, and Make UK's Chief Economist, Seamus Nevin. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Just to give you a kind of a rundown of the order of play for this webinar, Seamus will be providing us with a high-level manufacturing and economic update, which, and after that, as I said, I'd be delighted to be joined in conversation with Stephen to get his views on the manufacturing sector. Clearly, there are a lot of factors going on and things going on both government level and industry level to discuss with Stephen and to really understand where the opportunities and challenges for the industry exist, go both in the short term and in the long term. Just to say also, as part of our Q3 report launch, which, as I said, comes out on Thursday, we also have a spotlight on inflationary pressures that manufacturers are seeing and expect to see over the next 6 to 12 months. So that will also be coming out as part of the release on Thursday, and you will be receiving the Outlook report plus the spotlight as part of that, along with the recording of this webinar on Thursday. So expect that in your inbox. After the conversation with Stephen, we'll be opening up the lines for any live questions and answers as well. So please do submit any questions that you may have through the Q&A functionality, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick those up at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Seamus to give us a quick view of the market. Seamus.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks everybody for joining. Just to say as well, I unfortunately picked up a bit of a bug over the weekend and was losing my voice, so I hope you all can hear me. I also hope my voice sticks with me for the sake of this presentation. It will be a bit more high level and shorter than my usual presentation, but nonetheless, hopefully just as interesting. Pal, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide, please. So these are just the usual data points that we present every quarter, just to give you a summary of the key takeaways from our survey this term. I think, as you can see from the results, the new Prime Minister would be forgiven for wondering if they've inherited a bit of a poison chalice. The escalating cost of living means millions of UK households look set to experience the largest collapse in living standards since records began 60 years ago. In addition, inflation has hit a 50-year high, while this quarter the UK reported its worst trade deficit since records began. The Bank of England is now predicting perhaps the longest downturn since the global financial crisis of 2008, and it recently upped its interest rates by 0.5%, which is the biggest it's done in 27 years in an attempt to cool rising consumer prices. Another rise in interest rates was already on the cards before Queen Elizabeth's passing or demise delayed the bank's decision. If anything, that pause has made the case for rapid monetary tightening even clearer. The only question is how far policymakers will go in their meeting on Thursday. We will find out later in the week. The big change since the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee last met in early August has been the new Prime Minister Liz Truss's plan to cap energy bills for households and for businesses at an estimated cost of around 200 billion. This will lead inflation to fall faster in the next few months, but the plan amounts to a huge fiscal stimulus that will probably keep it higher in the medium term unless the MPC acts to offset it. Most economists expect that the arrival of the government stimulus means the Bank of England won't be racing towards rate cuts next year, unlike some of our rivaled market counterparts, developed market counterparts. But financial traders too are betting that the MPC will act even more aggressively in response to high inflation this week than it did in August. So that's one thing worth keeping an eye on. On a positive note, employment growth is relatively strong this quarter, and employers said that they will continue headhunting in the next 3 months. Yet current recruitment rates are falling far short of what manufacturers intended to hire last quarter. This, I think, is a clear sign of labour and skills shortages in the workforce. and as a result, overall investment intentions remain fairly stagnant. Government can't make it rain, but policymakers can create the right climate for growth. So reforming the apprenticeship levy, labour migration policy, the shortage occupation list, I think will all be key to helping the manufacturing sector recruit the staff and the talent that they need over the coming months. International forecasters, including the OECD, say that Great Britain is more susceptible to recession as a result of all of these factors than many of our Western economy counterparts. And the IMF is among the group predicting that the UK will see the slowest growth and most painful inflation of any G7 economy in 2023, thanks in part to our relatively high reliance on fossil fuels, the big driver of inflation, and obviously an external factor that is really outside of our domestic ability to control at the moment because of the war in Ukraine. Electricity prices, which had shot up as economies around the world recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic, have been sent soaring due to supply disruptions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ofgem raised the energy price cap, limiting the amount suppliers can charge households by 80%, and that affected roughly 23 million households in England, Scotland, and Wales. The typical domestic consumer will now pay about £3,250 from October, then 3,300 from January, with estimates peaking at around 5,000 were it not for the government's intervention. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, the government has recently announced a major intervention to help businesses who were not protected by this cap. We are awaiting the details on that, but it is nevertheless an absolutely welcome thing for businesses, because according to our recent survey, about 60% of manufacturers said that the price increases that they were facing due to the changes in the electricity market were business threatening for them over the coming months and year. Price increases means less disposable income for households to spend on other things, which will likely result in knock-on effects throughout the economy, particularly at the front line in terms of the retail sector, but also for manufacturers too. So it's something to be concerned about. Activity in consumer-facing services were already down by 4.9% compared to before the pandemic, but the British Retail Consortium say sales are now falling at a rate not seen since the depths of the COVID-19 lockdown. So this isn't just bad news for the worst off, it's also bad news for everybody else. The impact of all of this is borne out in Make UK and BDO's Manufacturing Outlook Survey result this quarter. Manufacturers are reporting that the cost of doing business remains exorbitantly high. UK and export market prices are at near record levels for the second quarter in a row, and as a result, profit margins have collapsed even further than they had previously. Output and order levels remain low but stable, with no sign of the difficult business environment improving anytime soon. Rising prices and falling margins offer an ominous forecast, indicating trading could become unsustainable for some businesses. So we're looking at a very difficult few months over the coming quarter for a lot of manufacturers. Nor is it just energy that has affected this. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has disrupted global supply chains in other areas too, and increased freight costs at a time when the UK rail and port workers were threatening to go on strike. Strikes that had been planned for the last couple of weeks were postponed upon news of Her Majesty's demise, but we can expect trade unions to make new announcements in the coming weeks about when those strikes will now take place. The war has also increased manufacturing costs for inputs, including rare earth metals and fertilizer. Reduced crop yields following the summer heat waves will further push up the cost of groceries, and consequently the Food and Drink Federation, which represents UK manufacturers in that subsector, said price inflation, which had already risen by 8.7% in the year to May, might not peak until well into next year, and that food and drink prices could increase by above 10% as a result. On a positive note, regionally, we have seen fairly consistent results, except for the one outlier, which is Northern Ireland, which has seen its economic output hit an all-time high this quarter. But one consequence is that the UK has now reached our post-EU quota for steel, meaning that steel exports from Great Britain to Northern Ireland now face a 25% tariff. So we will need to keep an eye on that, and government will be working hard to support firms affected in that sector. And then the other side of this is that the bad news for manufacturers who have recently been informed that the UK's EU REACH regime, which is the scheme for registering industrial chemicals, the cost of doing that has now increased. The final cost of doing that has now been estimated to be about 2 billion, which is about twice the original cost estimates predicted by government. So that's another cost for member firms and manufacturing firms that will be affected in those sectors that they will be looking at over the next few months and years. In May, the government announced £37 billion worth of help for households with the rising energy bills. The further announcement of up to 200 billion in energy bills to support businesses is obviously very welcome, but all in all, we're seeing some negative results this quarter, which I think is a sign of just how difficult the climate is for many businesses at the moment. So just to review in terms of those headlines you can see on your screens, output and orders are still sluggish, and supply chain problems mean that the output gap, the gap between firms' ability to meet their order demand remains there. That's something that is causing a lot of difficulties for business, but at least it means that business is retained for the time being. UK orders now comprise a bigger share of trade than export orders, but the difference between these figures is fairly marginal. It's not something to panic about, but it's not a good sign nevertheless. Prices remain exorbitantly high, and profit margins as a result are declining slightly more rapidly than in previous quarters. Employment intentions, however, do remain very positive, and firms are really looking to hire quite a lot of people. There are 93,000 vacancies in the sector at the moment. So there's clearly a lot of firms crying out for staff and for talent, and that I think bodes well. Investment intentions also remain fairly stable, which is a good sign, all things considered. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. So based on these, and as a result, we have made our usual forecast predictions for the sector and for the overall UK economy. So our manufacturing output forecast for the rest of this year remains at 2.4%, but has been halved for next year to 0.6%. So that's just for the manufacturing sector. For the UK economy as a whole, our UK GDP forecast for 2022 also remains the same at 3.6%. But has been cut by over a full percentage point for next year from the 1.4% growth rate previously predicted to a much lower 0.3% growth now expected for the overall economy next year. So in some grey clouds appear to be gathering over our economy at present, but the best political leaders can make the weather, and the new administration in number 10 have already made clear they're only in office wet week, but they've staked their claim for being very ambitious in terms of the interventions that they're willing to make to optimize growth. So ending a decade of stagnant productivity and real wage growth has been declared by Liz Truss to be her top priority, and Make UK and BDO and others will be working hard over the next few months to show government that supporting Britain's world-beating manufacturing sector would be a great place to start. But I'm in danger of transgressing into Richard and Stephen's discussion points there, so I will stop for now and thank you all for listening. Richard.
Right, I'm just drawing breath, Seamus, after that lot. Yeah, I mean, I think you said a positive note once throughout the whole of that talk. It's pretty obvious that we've got some significant headwinds coming our way. And I think, you know, it's a combination of businesses to weather that storm, but also with the support and understanding of government as well. And we'll pick up on those points between Stephen and I. And if there are any questions as we go through as well, please do add those to the Q&A section. Just by way of introduction to Stephen. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll give you a quick your quick CV very quickly for those who don't know you, Stephen. So Stephen is the Chief Executive of Make UK, and you've been the Chief Exec since joining in 2017. But prior to that, you've had a significant experience both as a senior civil servant, having worked as head of the Defence and Security Organisation, and also Director of Security Industry Engagement. You'll have to tell me what that means, Stephen. It sounds very impressive.
It's top secret, Richard. I can't.
Okay, you could tell me, but yeah, it's that old story. Yeah, again, around security and counter-terrorism at the Home Office. But prior to that as well, Stephen spent over 35 years holding senior roles in manufacturing businesses, including 15 years at Smiths Group as president of Smiths Detection, and also cut his teeth in the early days, way back when he was wearing shorts as an engineering apprentice at Plessey. So Stephen is a dyed-in-the-wool manufacturing person on both sides of the spectrum, all the way from apprentice through to his current role at Makiko. So Stephen, thank you very much for joining us today. Did I miss anything out?
No, Richard, thank you. That was a wonderful synopsis. Better than I could have done it myself. Fantastic.
Great stuff. After sort of having that rather sobering update from Seamus, now clearly, we've been talking about this over the last few quarters, that there's a lot of turbulence out there. I mean, the whole market hasn't really had a chance to catch its breath since prior to COVID. Clearly, at the moment, we've dealt with the pandemic. There's Brexit still, shaking off that as well in terms of some of the trading friction that we're seeing. As Seamus was saying, labour shortages as well as a big element that we're talking about as well. And clearly that means potentially there's that shift in power between employer and employee as well, which is kind of resulting in some of the industrial action that we're expecting to see and have seen previously. And then on top of that, we've got the broader supply chain disruption driven by sort of macroeconomic and global pressures and inflation off the back of that. And on top of that, we got the energy price situation as well. So there's a huge amount for the industry to try and digest and work out what's going on, which way's up, and what they should do. And clearly, we have a new government in place, as we were saying. There's an impending emergency budget, which I think you might have an update on how that's going to get rolled out this week as well, which we'll touch on. But I think more broadly, there's a question from our side, which is, based on the conversations you've been having both in government and outside as well, where are the areas that you think should be the focus for government to provide support over the coming days, hours, weeks, months, years? If you could provide us an update on what you're hearing in terms of how that information is going to be shared, that would be quite a good starting point, I think.
I will do. Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll probably just start by saying that all sounds extremely depressing. And having been in the manufacturing sector now for, as you said, 40 years, we've been through these phases before, and it's an incredibly resilient sector and one that's very pragmatic, and we do find our way through. I think it's unusual to have so many headwinds at the same time, and I think that's what you reflected in where you are. And I also think, in talking to cabinet ministers, that there is a high value placed on the manufacturing sector, which has not been there. I mean, the pandemic brought a lot of that on in terms of understanding about national resilience. And in a world where we see the global geopolitics changing, there's a very, very clear focus on having a strong manufacturing sector. So we can take some heart that there will be some support from governments. Now, where that sits is going to be interesting. I think obviously the most immediate concern is energy costs, and that applies right the way throughout the manufacturing sector, but different in different parts of it. It's worth reflecting on that. As you know, we've got UK Steel, which is an energy intensive user group of all the steel manufacturers in the UK. And their point isn't so much the absolute cost of energy, it's the relative competitive cost of energy compared to their competition in mainland Europe. So their plea to me is not so much the absolute pence per megawatt hour cost of energy. It's about the fact that now, because it's a much higher part of your cost of sales, it's now material in that cost of sales and material for competition. Therefore, you need to make sure it's dynamically aligned to your competition. So their plea is, can we somehow, with government, have a mechanism to say, well, if the government takes £100 a megawatt hour off the cost of electricity, but the Germans are 120, it doesn't help. What helps is some sort of alignment. So that's a very interesting point on energy intensive users. And I certainly have got personal messages from the Chancellor Kwasi, who, as you know, we've had a very long-term and very positive relationship with, to say that at the top of his mind is thinking about the energy-intensive users, the ceramic manufacturers, the chemicals manufacturing, steel manufacturing, all of that part of the manufacturing point. So I would expect to see them in that area. They've already started that process, but see something there about protecting those industries and in some way making sure they're competitive. That's going to be important. What we don't want to see in a rush to getting a solution out, Richard, is really a sectoral approach. I mean, there's been a lot in the media about the challenges of hospitality, which is correct, of course. But if you just help hospitality through the manufacturing lens, you're not helping the supply chain, the food and drink manufacturers, the equipment suppliers, and then that won't help hospitality in the medium term. So we need to make sure that this is not a sectoral approach to support, which some papers have been reflecting on over the weekend. We don't really want to see that, but we do expect something. The other issue that we've been speaking to Treasury about, and all of us, all the business groups have been inputting into Treasury very frequently over the last few weeks with all of our thoughts and ideas and questions and reflections on some of their sort of ideas that they're coming up with themselves. But again, this is about debt, and we shouldn't forget that. This is really about debt. And we already have the manufacturing sector with a lot of debts. We have the COVID schemes, you know, the recovery loan schemes, the CBILS schemes. People are starting to repay those debts. And so basically adding more debt to that is not going to be incredibly helpful. But we do recognize that for those businesses where this is an immediate threat to their survival, they will take a cheap government loan in the form of a repayment back on your energy bills over the next 10 years to try and get through this extreme difficulty. So we're not going to be unsupportive of that. But the truth of the matter is we don't know the detail, Richard. We are waiting for the detail. I've got a briefing this evening with the business secretary, which I'm very much looking forward to. And I hope that's going to give us a bit of a preview as to what is apparently going to be an announcement on this tomorrow, probably followed by a broader announcement on Friday. So we may hear some news as early as tomorrow morning. And at 5:30 this evening, we may get a heads up on exactly what that's going to look like. And we can then have that debate before those things are actually launched into the public domain tomorrow. So energy is at the forefront of it. As Seamus said, another 60% number is that in October, 60% of businesses in the UK have to renew their energy contracts. So we're approaching that cliff edge, whereas already we've seen the ones that have renegotiated or have been subject to their long-term fixes removed, increases in the average of 4 times their normal energy costs. If you're an SME, up to 10 times. So that's the kind of range we're seeing. And for many businesses, I must have been getting 5 or 6 letters a day from members with really detailed accounts of how that's affected their business. And some of these numbers are just eye-watering. So the government does need to step in. The other thing we do know is it's probably likely to kick in November and then backdated to October. So there will be a period of where in some way or other businesses will need to find the money to pay those bills in the additional month that they're probably not receiving any benefit from government. But again, we'll wait and see what the details look like and how that's going to play out. We will come on to opportunities, but I would say just as a last point, Richard, on this is that equal in many chief execs' minds, especially the larger manufacturing groups, is the labour shortage. That's of equal weight to them as the energy shortage. And in many ways, if we think about the longer term of the manufacturing sector, the labour shortage one is the real difficult one. That's we'll get through the energy crisis. There will be a solution. People will get through it. But the real problem, the worrying thing for most larger companies is the labour and skill shortage in the country. Yeah,
it's, you're absolutely right. I think your point on, the energy situation hopefully will be transient and their support will be put in place. It's measurable, it's visible, and therefore it will get addressed in some shape or form, depending, and your point is right. The question is, how does it get paid for further down the line? You don't really get anything for free in this world, unfortunately.
That's right.
So, and I think that point around employment, that's something that's been kind of systemic within the industry for quite some time now. And even now, with the results we've just seen, we're seeing all the other messages that Seamus has taken us through, but that employment piece is still a pressure point. And I guess that's one of the things that's quite different in the current environment, is that employment piece is still massively high up the agenda.
In fact, Richard, it's getting higher up the agenda. I would say, you know, we've gone from a period, and we always used to argue this, of having a skill shortage, particularly on vocational skills in the sector, to now having a labour shortage, and the fundamental dynamics are different here. And this is what is for me, it's the more concerning issue of the two, because I'm starting to see some large companies now put on ice their investment plans, not because of energy, but because of labour and skill shortages is the issue. And when we look at this in more detail, I gave evidence recently at a Bay Select Committee on this very issue on labour in the sector and really what's behind it with some colleagues. And three things are around us at the moment that are affecting this. One is obviously leaving the EU. And if we look at that one and go back into historical context, 20 years ago, the government could see the demographics of the UK population. And we had, by the time we got to the mid-2020s, here we are now, a shortage of about 1.5 million workers in the 18 to 30-year-old age group. So the answer 20 years ago was to encourage membership of the Eastern European states, so we could have migratory labour come to the UK and fill that gap. And that was absolutely adopted by several different governments up until the Brexit vote, because that was the way to make sure we had enough people to fuel the economy and growth into the future. When we obviously left the EU, what we haven't done is put in place an alternative to that. We've seen 1.2 million EU workers go back, so roughly the same size as the 1.5 million that we knew we were going to have a gap in. We've got quite a strict shortage occupation list, meaning it's very difficult to have them come into the UK. And for the last 25 years, the number in the manufacturing sector has been a rotating 200,000 EU workers out of the 2.7 million historically. So we don't have access to that anymore. So that's one factor. Second factor is the economically inactive that have resulted as a result of the pandemic. So that's gone from pre-pandemic about 100,000 in the stats to now currently 700,000. Average age 50. Of course, the manufacturing age group average is 52. So it really does disproportionately affect that skilled 50-year-old work group in the manufacturing sector. I was asked by ministers where these people had gone, whether an alien had come down and sucked them up and taken them away, or what's happened to these people. And we did some work on that with some of the larger companies and found that many people downsized. They, after the pandemic, sold their houses, downsized, moved out, took the money, put it in the bank, and are living off that. And I'm very happy, thank you very much. And I've got no intention to go back to the workforce and face COVID again and things of that nature. But that's quite a sizable chunk, that 700,000. And thirdly is the apprentice program, because we are talking about vocational skills here. And if we look back at pre the levy, so before 2016, our average apprentice starts in this country were 130,000 a year. And if we look at where we're going to be this year, it's somewhere around 30,000. So ever since then, and we are not generating, because we need to reform the levy, because there's all sorts of structural issues around that. We're not generating the vocational skills. I've now got manufacturers, some very large, well-known brand names, stopping their graduate program, putting every penny they've got into vocational training. They need tool makers, they need CNC operators, they need mechatronics engineers fixing robots, and we just don't have them. And we have no access to EU labour to do those jobs. We have been pushing hard with the Home Office on the shortage occupation list. We've got a pitch for 2 government categories that would free a lot of this up. But I must say we're in ideologically extremely different places as far as that's concerned. And so we end up with the stats that Seamus talked about. You know, we've now got unemployment down to a very low level, vacancies higher than the unemployed, in manufacturing around 94,000. By the way, that's at the average of £21 million a day per for that group. That's about 7 billion of lost GDP a year for the manufacturing sector. And those vacancies are sticky vacancies, post 6 months in many cases, some of them up to a year. And we do have some members now, particularly Formula One teams. If you're a tool maker, they simply say, tell us what you're earning, we'll double it. We don't care what it is, we'll double it. And they're trying to pay £100,000 for tool makers at the moment, but they still don't have any takers, even with that.
I'll update my CV, Stephen.
Exactly. I thought about doing that. Yes, I could do a bit of tool making. Yes, exactly. So I think for me, that's the big nut to crack, and that's where with this government, you know, we'll get through this energy crisis thing, but that's going to be the next big thing. And I think what's worrying me is it's starting to make people think about their investment plans, Richard. And I think that's the thing we need to guard against, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I was going to come on to that because, clearly with the industry having been through what it's been through so far, obviously they've had to batten down the hatches. As you say, it is a very resilient industry, but your natural response is to go, right, okay, I need to preserve cash, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's unpredictability out there, there's inflation going on. Maybe my my ex-factory prices aren't keeping up with my input costs in terms of whatever I'm making and adding value to. And that kind of raises the challenge of, well, what do I do? Do I invest in new technologies? Do I invest in green technologies, sort of net zero and efficiency? And can I afford to? I mean, in terms of what you're seeing at the moment from your membership, what's the sort of mood music that you're getting at the moment?
Well, big investments suspended, generally speaking. I mean, there's some areas of real highlight there, but generally people are thinking twice, mainly because the worry is, can I get the factory workers to fill the factories to do this if I extend it? Where we are seeing investment, and where, if we can turn the conversation to a more positive aspect to this, is in areas where we've seen the energy crisis. What's the opposite? What's the corollary of that? And that is really about investing in efficient processes in the business. We're seeing a lot of companies thinking about alternate energy sources. We've got some large members which will be off grid next year. We've got a lot of people thinking about alternative ways of powering up using solar panels or whatever it might be to power up their production processes, and investment following that. That's good. We want the government to incentivize that more. On the other side of the net zero equation, I mean, the most encouraging things I've seen over the last few months have been the enormous investments that are going on right now in things like offshore wind, CCUS, very, very large developments. I mean, if you want to cheer yourself up about the manufacturing sector, go on a tour of the old Redcar Steel site up at Teesside, Richard, and have a look at what they're doing there. Some of those investments and the new factories that are being constructed, by the way, much to the anger of many local businesses who wonder where they're going to get the skills from, but that's another issue. But really creating fantastic new facilities to build the next generation of net zero technologies in the country. And I think, I was always a little bit skeptical about this claim that it will create 100,000 new jobs, but I can see it doing it. I can absolutely see. And we can see areas where inward investment is coming in and people are creating these new manufacturing facilities. That's extremely good. The other part of this, which we're seeing quite a few people looking at now, and I think partly is due to us all getting used to this during the pandemic, but this acceleration of digital adoption is really welcome. We're seeing a lot of people. They may not be big investments in many cases, and it doesn't need to be a large investment in a small manufacturing operation, but we are seeing a massive increase in the amount of interest, participation, questions coming through, plans to invest in digitization to try to make them more energy efficient and to try to address the labor issue primarily. So people are getting concerned about that. And so really driving some investment there in digitization. I think, we've obviously been part of that through the Make Smarter program that we've been holding as the commission here with government. But we're now seeing a massive appetite for many manufacturing businesses to get on that digital adoption program and they've seen the improvements they can make through doing it. And now's a good time, if there's any investment money available, to invest in digital. So I think that's really, really positive. Something we've been trying to encourage for years, had slow progress with it. And all of a sudden we've seen the rate on our surveys increased from 18% interest to 90% interest. Everyone wants to do a digital program now in their business, which I think is extremely encouraging. But I think energy difficulties, labor shortages, post-pandemic, that's kind of driven the outcome. One of the outcomes is around digitizing the manufacturing process. And I think that's really important. Of course, in some areas, a bit of a challenge. So again, if you look at it sectorally, food and drink manufacturers, traditionally reliant on, parts of them reliant on low-cost labor, can't get it anymore. So can we automate the processes? Yes, we can. Let's start big automation processes. But then, of course, we recognize we haven't got the digital skills. We're looking for data analytics and digital engineers, only to find that they're in short supply as well and quite difficult to get hold of. Although you need less of them than you do lots of people on the shop floor. But again, so it does work on where the priorities need to be for the skills agenda. But before we get to that, I think the first thing we need to do is solve the bodies. It's the actual people we need to solve. And I think that's going to be a task with government over the next few weeks to try and say this is of equal importance to many businesses.
Yeah, in terms of those conversations with government, obviously, you know Kwasi from his previous role. Do you feel that the place on the agenda for manufacturing has gone up or gone down based on the change of government that we currently had or we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I think Kwasi. I mean, Kwasi is a very interesting case. So, as you said, we were counting them. We're up to 67 meetings with Kwasi Kwarteng. Okay, we started off. It was, I would say, he wasn't that familiar with the sector. He's ended up as an expert in the sector, a champion for the sector, and someone that, as soon as there was a new factory being opened, which of course all politicians like their face on the front of the newspaper when that happens, but was very keen to say, Stephen, come along with me, let's go and talk to these people, let's look at how these businesses are doing. And I must say, when we had interventions on very manufacturing specific things which we felt were nationally critical, a completely instant response from Kwasi on those and addressing them. So really, really good support from Kwasi. I'd be very surprised if he forgets that experience going in to be Chancellor. And looking at his text to me, I think he hasn't. And I think he will absolutely have that. I mean, it's never going to be number one, but it's going to be up the top there in the priority list, certainly, of things the Chancellor will be thinking about. So definitely got that with him. The others we have to see. I mean, I'm on my fifth. I've been doing this job nearly 5 years, Richard. I think this Jacob Rees-Mogg will be my fifth business secretary in this. We have to convert him as well, don't we? That's what we have to. That's what we did with Kwasi, and I'm sure we will do. And certainly we've had good various meetings, some very good interventions on the steel side with Jacob in the past in his previous role, and he's very well briefed. He understands. He's a very intelligent guy. So we should be able to make rational cases with him. I guess we'll see starting this evening how that goes. But so again, I think manufacturing, because we are in what they like to. I mean, Liz Truss has talked about economic growth. It's about exporting. 50% of the exports are manufactured goods. You can't but mean that must mean that manufacturing is a priority. So I have no doubt that we will be up there on the agenda and making sure that. As far as they can, government can help the sector through this, Richard. I think I've got every confidence in that.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Let's see what comes out. Yeah, exactly. I guess the other side of it is kind of the more, like you were saying, there are some transient things that hopefully we'll get releases on over the next 48 hours, 30, or 72 hours, in terms of what can be done around. The price spikes in energy, just more broadly in terms of other things that you'd like to see from the new government. Are there certain aspects or elements that also would maybe outside of the employment situation, but we can pick on that as well. But what else are you keen to see from the new government?
Well, there's a couple of other short-term things we want to see. If on the budgetary side, we absolutely need to address the cost of doing business, which means removing pre-profit taxes, or at least reducing them. So hopefully we'll see the reversal of the NIC increase. We need business rates reform, which we've been talking about for the last 3 years and haven't got there. VAT changes, levy. I mean, there's all sorts of things, a whole package of suggestions that we've made to the Treasury around easing the cost burden on business. So that's a short-term thing that needs to happen. We've also pushed very hard on the extension of super deduction and the expansion of super deduction, which before this latest change of administration, they'd agreed to, but they hadn't announced. So let's see if that goes forward. And that was really about matching it to the 7-year investment cycle in manufacturing and making sure we can include leasehold equipment in there as well, rather than just capital. But that was certainly on the agenda. And in the medium term, I think we have such a great opportunity here, Richard, with onshoring. I mean, I talked to hundreds of businesses. We did a couple of really interesting big interventions last week, and we see a lot of changes happening in supply chains right now. We see step one as quite a large move from China to Turkey. A lot of companies doing that, and in fact, our chair is the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Turkey, and has just come back from Turkey, and was astonished to see how many British companies have moved things from China to Turkey and how vibrant all that is. It's like the Wild West out there at the moment in manufacturing terms. And likewise, the next step of that is bringing it back to the UK. And this is where we've got a great opportunity. What we need to see government do is incentivize that process. We need to see them say, in this case, I mean, if you are an inward investor, you get a project manager at DIT, you get help with the local authorities, they find you a factory site. I mean, you get complete handholding if you're an inward investor. We should have the same support for businesses that want to bring back manufacturing into this country, because this is probably our best opportunity for 30 years, Richard, to increase dramatically what we're doing here. Not in consumer goods, we're not going to be making toasters and fridges, but certainly on the supply chain for the advanced manufacturing stuff that we do. This is a great opportunity. So we really want to see a package of support for doing that. Absolutely vital. And then on top of that, of course, there's a lot of other things that need to happen. The government gets grumpy with me about the lack of utilization of the Energy Transformation Fund, for example, the ETF. Not many people know about it. B, it's quite complicated to navigate. That needs to be a great driver for converting a lot of these companies to use alternative energy sources. I mean, it's a great program. We just need to make it a little bit simpler and start to communicate what we're doing there. So things like that. I mean, the government's got the right ideas. A lot of it's about making it easier to access and making it available in terms of communicating it, which is why we quite like this idea that Lee Rowley had about producing a manufacturing manifesto, as it were, or a prospectus, as he called it, which was really a website, a GovUK website, where in one place any manufacturer could go and see every support package that was available.
Yep.
Because it's so opaque at the moment to do that. So, I mean, these things they can fix quite quickly.
Yeah, that's totally echoes the conversations we've had as well with our clients. Is that half the time they don't know what's available.
Exactly.
And the other half of the time, even if they know what's available, it's so onerous to go through the process that they kind of go, do you know what? It's too much like hard work. So I totally agree that opportunity to actually have almost a one-stop shop for manufacturers to look in and say, do you know what?
Yeah.
If I have these criteria for my business, therefore I potentially have access to these pots of investment available to me, I think makes it sometimes I sort of blows my mind slightly that it doesn't exist already. It just seems like common sense, doesn't it? It's all a question of coordinating and communicating.
I was talking to the team that's doing this, that's creating this at the moment.
Yeah,
it's still going on. I mean, we'll see if Jacob's still. I'll try and push him to make sure he continues to support it. But they were up to something like 2,500 schemes. When you look at it, local authority schemes, and they hadn't gone down to the very local schemes. They'd just gone to the LEP level and the combined authority level. So it's very complicated. Very complicated.
Yeah. It just seems sometimes beggars belief on that side. Just going back, I know we sort of said that energy is obviously transient, but clearly it's quite significant at the same time. One of the questions I had for you is just around, they've talked around a 6-month support package. In your opinion and Make UK membership opinion, is that sufficient? Is it appropriate? Just to get your views on that as well.
Well, our position is a very clear position on that, Richard. That is completely inappropriate. So 6 months is not long enough. It needs to be longer. We want to see 12 months minimum. The sector needs to have stability and certainty. 6 months doesn't even get a window to bid on a contract very often. So what pricing are you going to put in for that Rolls-Royce fan blade contract that you're bidding on at the moment that won't start for 6 months? I mean, in manufacturing, that just simply does not work. And it doesn't give you the certainty that people are asking for at the moment. What does that mean? We're going to go tripling or quadrupling energy prices 6 months later. I mean, and particularly when it's a high part of the cost of sale. So we need longer than that. I dare say we'll have to have a very robust debate about that. But certainly a minimum of 12 months. And why not the same as the consumer one, which they're fixed at 2 years at this stage of the game? We just need to give business certainty. Without it, they won't be investing, which is the problem. If they can't see further forward than that, they won't be investing.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to something on the radio this morning, actually. They were talking about renewable energy and companies such as Vestas and GE, who actually invested quite heavily in the UK until the feed-in tariff changed, at which point the economics kind of didn't quite make sense anymore, and they kind of moved out again and moved elsewhere. And it's interesting to hear that we're starting to see that shift back. You're talking about in the northeast, people are seeing that you know what, there is an opportunity here, but it does go back to having certainty in terms of income and the business case that sits around that. So
exactly. I mean, the main job of government policy is to set the environment, and that stable environment is absolutely vital to invest in. Otherwise, we'll be back in the same discussion about why we're not investing in 6 months' time if we're not careful.
Yeah, exactly. Super. Stephen, thank you very much for that. Are there any other sort of points or observations that you'd kind of like to add before we kind of go to open things up to questions?
Probably back just quickly to say on the net zero thing again, Richard, we are seeing lots and lots of innovative startups happening in the manufacturing sector right now. And I think I've said it before, but 2 years ago we had 0 hydrogen fuel cell manufacturers. We've got 62 now. And it's a very interesting dynamic. It's moving much quicker than the media reports would suggest, and it's becoming a very large and interesting part of the economy. And also, I mean, along that line, as you know, we've started our sort of Make Modular business unit, which is the modular housing part of the activity, which are basically big factories building these net zero homes, and that's almost doubled in size in terms of what we're doing now. And it's just worth, we talk about net zero kind of sometimes in a little bit of distant terms, but the practical application of it and what's happening on the ground is really interesting. I think BDO, as a bit of a focus, a sectoral focus in manufacturing, it would be very interesting to get across this whole thing about where we go from modular net zero housing all the way through to the infrastructure part of it, CCUS, and what's happening there. I'm just so enthused by the scale of the factories I'm seeing at the moment. They're much bigger than anything else I've seen in manufacturing for many years, Richard, to be honest with you.
Yeah, we've been around a few of those actually, and it's amazing to watch in the industrialization of, our traditional way of building houses is very, very different to what they can do now in those factories, and embedding future technologies in them as well, which makes them super efficient.
Absolutely.
Going forwards, and the ability to sort of almost bolt on additional new technologies as you go along is very, very exciting. Very exciting area. Super. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. I think if we can hand over to Belle, I think if we open up for Q&A, then we can try and pick those off between myself, Stephen, and Seamus as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. We've just had the one question come through, and that was during Seamus's update. So I'll pose that to you, Seamus, but Stephen, Richard, feel free to add your thoughts as well. How far do you think the base rate will go, and what timescales are we looking at for interest rates to start falling again?
Excuse me, that's what I call a Yogi Berra question. He famously said that predicting stuff is very difficult, especially about the future. I think financial markets are probably the best indicator on this. They're expecting the MPC to go further this Thursday in their announcement than they did in August when they raised rates by 0.5 percentage points. That, remember, was the biggest rate increase in 27 years. It was quite significant. The markets are currently expecting about a 0.75% increase, which implies rates peaking sometime next year, probably at about 4.5%. So I think probably a peak rate of about 4.5% midway through next year. The other side of this, of course, is a lot of the factors that are contributing to the MPC's decision making are external to the UK. It's largely to do with the energy crisis and the consequences of the war in Ukraine. I might be being overly optimistic here, but the latest news from President Erdogan in Turkey is that Putin is suggesting he's willing to pull out of that war. So maybe that things will start to improve on the energy front a little earlier than had been recently predicted. But for the moment, I'm sticking with that prediction of about 4.5% midway through next year.